Good evening, everyone. I'm David Suddjian, and welcome to Bird Bombs, helpful bursts of ID info. This is episode 16. It's a flycatcher. Now, tonight we're talking flycatchers. In the tyrant flycatcher family, Tyrannidae is the largest bird family in the world. Think about that for a minute, the biggest one out of all of them. Colorado has recorded 31 species of flycatchers. That's a lot. And several vagrants may yet be found in future years that would be new state records. In fact, the flycatcher family is maybe one of the richest groups to provide some new species for Colorado. So it's pretty exciting. 18 different species nest in Colorado, a lot of different nesters. And some of the flycatchers are pretty easy to identify, including some of the ones we're going to look at tonight. And you know, like when you see a scissor-tail flycatcher with nice tail, long tail feathers, it's pretty easy to tell what that is, but some of them present some very serious ID challenges. And finding flycatchers in their nesting habitats is a great way to learn to ID them. But you know, it takes time and effort to get to where they are, and sometimes some know-how about how to find those places. And you know, encountering migrants is a lot easier. Here we are at the beginning of May, and the door is just opening for a lot of these flycatchers to come through. We're already seeing a few, maybe the most are yet ahead of us. And it's convenient to encounter them sort of near to home where we go birding, but ID can be more difficult because you may not have the clues, the cues of habitat or the songs, which are very important to consider for flycatcher ID. So, you know, what is an ardent birder to do? Well, first off, let's figure out that sometimes it's not a flycatcher, right? There's a lot of different birds that can either look similar or behave similar and fool us a little bit. So there's a lot of little things that are in the yellow, green, brown, gray category, and they're small and they flit around, but they're not all necessarily flycatchers. Lots of birds flycatch. Flycatchers do it for a living, but other birds may also, or they do it opportunistically. I just saw jays flycatching the other day, so that's pretty different. But cedar waxwings like to flycatch, and there are quite a few others. Warblers, kinglets will sally out after insects and flycatch, but they're not flycatchers. Flycatchers are known for perching upright, but not all birds that perch upright are flycatchers, as you know, like with Townsend solitaires. And flycatchers have eye rings and wing bars on some species or many of the more difficult species, but not everything with an eye ring or wing bars is a flycatcher. So they can't go everywhere with all those features. These birds, these groups on the right-hand side of the screen are some of the ones that could be mistaken for flycatchers in a general sense, either by their behavior or general appearance, their activities. So those are some of the ones you want to especially be thinking about. So you want to look at what you're looking at, and indeed, not everything is a flycatcher that seems like it could be. I love this picture of the ruby crown blowing up its top there, but you know, even some of the flycatchers have colored crowns that we don't often see, concealed coronal patches. All right. So we're talking perching birds, Passeriformes, and the family Tyrannidae. And tyrant flycatchers have proportionally large heads, and they have wide flattened bills with a hooked tip, and they have prominent rectal bristles. Those are the bristles that are around the base of the bill. And you may not see them out in the field, but they're relatively prominent, and they probably play a role in helping the bird in its foraging. One of the things that's important is that the timing of the pre-basic molt varies among different species. What that means for us birders is that the molt is affecting how the feathers look, whether they look fresh or whether they're worn. And so it's good to learn a little bit about when that happens. But for the ones that are the most challenging for us to ID, namely the Empidonax flycatchers, most of them are molting where they winter and not here. So that means that when we see them in the summertime, they're in their most worn condition all the way into when they depart at the end of summer and the very, very beginning of fall. So it's an important thing to think about. In most flycatchers, the sexes basically look the same. A couple species where that's different. One, the vermilion flycatcher, the other not occurring in Colorado, the rose-throated picard. They have differences, very strong differences between males and females, but mostly they look similar. And juveniles tend to look like adults. There's some telltale signs of juvenile birds that you can detect in flycatchers, but their general patterns, colors are similar. And most of the flycatchers are breeding when they come back around in their second year of life when they're 1 year old. All right, so all of our flycatchers are in Colorado are migratory, highly so. There's only one species that we find during the wintertime, and it's fairly sparse, and that's the Say's phoebe. All right, but everything else is totally out of here. One of the characteristic things about flycatchers is that they as they're fly catching, they fly out from a perch to hawk an insect. So they sally out from a perch, they catch what they're after, either in the air, maybe off foliage, or maybe on the ground, and they return to the same or a different perch. Very characteristic behavior of flycatchers. So that's something you can be watching for. Many of them build open cup nests, some are cavity nesters. So over here we have, on the right, we have a listing of all of Colorado's 31 recorded flycatchers. There's a lot there, so let's just take a minute to look at that list. We can see that there are 8 different genera, the genus, plural genera, all right, that these flycatchers are divided into. And for some of the genera, we have a fair number of species. Look at all those ones in the genus Tyrannus, all those kingbirds and other relatives in there. So a good variety there. And the biggest group is the hardest group, the Empidonax. A lot of different Empidonax have been recorded in Colorado. So a lot of diversity, the 31 species, but we're not going to deal with all of those tonight. 13 of these 31 are what I'm calling rarities. That means they do not occur regularly in Colorado. These are the ones in orange font here on the slide. And some of them, such as the great Kiskadee and the buff-breasted flycatcher, have occurred only single times, and others very few times. Some a little bit more, like the eastern wood-pewee. And some of these rarities are kind of stealth vagrants. They look a lot like their relatives that are more regular, and so it makes it much more difficult for us to detect some of them, particularly in the kingbird and Empidonax group. And then we have 3 of the nesting species that are annual, but in very small numbers, such as the vermilion flycatcher and the scissor-tail flycatcher, essentially annual in Colorado now with lots of eyes looking, or they're more limited to the far eastern part of the state, maybe not so rare as those others, but the great crested flycatcher we don't see really in the metro area except as a rarity. It's out there towards the eastern border of Colorado in its regular range. So we can drop out all of those rarities and things that are kind of out of the metro area. And we're going to just focus in on these 15 focal species. And we see that they're in 5 genera. So here on the left, we have all 15 species in their groups, and we have their 4-letter codes along the side there. We won't be using those too much tonight, but they're good to learn. And they're all pretty standard in terms of what the letters are and how pretty easy to figure out if you know what names you're dealing with. And let's look at these different genus names. It's kind of fun. So the genus Tyrannus, these are from the Latin or the Greek, and the Tyrannus is referring to a king or a lord. All right, so the whole family name Tyrannidae is coming from that idea of the king or lord. And it's coming from the fact that they are, like tyrants, they are aggressive by and large, some especially so. And so that's kind of where that's coming from. Myarchus, chief of flies. I love that. Saornis, that one's referring to the fellow that named the genus first, and that's Thomas Say, a naturalist from some years ago. Say's bird, Saornis. Contopus, short-footed. Okay, Contopus is the pewees, wood-pewees, olive-sided flycatcher. And then Empidonax, king of gnats. Isn't that great? It's the smallest bird, and they're the king of gnats. I love it. So let's stick with this idea of the different genera of these flycatchers. And the reason why is it's going to help us sort out these birds at a basic level. So if you're on the newer side of things, or no matter what, you want to be able to put them into the right categories, because that's going to do a lot of work for you to help you figure out what you're looking at. And some of these are pretty straightforward, but there is some rhyme and reason to what's going on here. So the Tyrannus kingbirds, they're bigger than the other flycatchers we have, and they tend to be conspicuous. They often have yellow or white underneath, and they live out in open countries or along woodland edges where they're mostly pretty easy to observe. And they're specialized for aerial hawking. They have long wings and they fly out making great flights out and come back to their perches on fences or poles or wherever it is on a tree. And they're very easy to observe. The next genus is the Maiarchus. And so these are birds that we only have one common representative in Colorado, the ash-throated flycatcher, but a few others have occurred. One is regular out east, the great crested, as I mentioned. The Maiarchus flycatchers are a little bit bigger than phoebes generally. They're smaller than kingbirds, a little more delicate. They have yellow on the belly. It might not be very bright, but they have yellow on the belly, and the species have varying amounts of rust on their primaries or on their tail. Here I mean rust coloring, not actual rust. So you got that rusty pattern in the primaries. Here you can see on this ash-throated flycatcher and on the tail. And these birds are kind of interesting among our flycatchers because they nest in cavities in trees or in boxes or even sometimes in buildings or in a pipe or something like that. So that's a little different. Cavity nesters, the Maiarchus. Seornis, the phoebes, they're bigger than pewees. They're an Empidonax, smaller generally than the Maiarchus that we have. And they're distinctive because they're kind of subtle in their tones for the most part. They tend to lack an eye ring. They don't have prominent wing bars. They often forage near the ground. And one of the things that phoebes do that's characteristic is they will wag or pump or flip their tail up, especially when they land. And some do it even at other times while they're perched there. And so a lot of tail action going on, very obvious as you're watching them. And phoebes tend to nest on buildings or under bridges or on natural vertical faces where there's an overhang. So they can be closely associated with where people are for that reason. And so the fourth genus we'll look at is the Cantopus, the wood-pewees. And now we're getting a little smaller. And these also specialize in aerial hawking, flying out some distance from a perch after a bug that they've spotted. And they tend to have relatively long and relatively wide bills to help them catch those insects in flight. And they perch in conspicuous spots, either on the top of a tree or along the margin of a tree crown, or sometimes out in the open on a fence line or something like that. Notice that the wood-pewees lack conspicuous eye rings. Okay, so that's going to help us separate them from some other small flycatchers. And wing bars are present, but they're not as prominent usually as on, say, the Empidonax. And they tend to be gray in their coloration. We don't see greens or yellows among the Cantopus. So that's the wood-pewees. And now we come to the last group, the Empidonax, and we sometimes just call them Empids. All right, so Empid is what we're going to use a lot tonight. So the gnat kings, and these are the smallest of the different genera. And they have eye rings, most of them a conspicuous eye ring, some less so. And they tend to have relatively prominent wing bars. They often flick their wings or tail. So this is unlike a lot of these other birds. I talked about the phoebes pumping their tail up and down, but the Empidonax are the only ones that flick their wings, and they will be flicking their tail. That's a very quick movement of the tail. Their colorations tend to be greenish or yellowish or grayish or whitish in those different ranges. And some of them even occur in the forest interior, unlike some of these other flycatcher groups that we're talking about. So there we have our 5 genera: Tyrannus, Maiarchus, Seornis, Cantopus, and Empidonax. So looking at it from that perspective, let's take it a little bit further and let's consider reference species. A reference species is a common representative of the group that you can see a lot of because it's numerous. Sometimes you have to make the effort to see them, but they're relatively easy to study because you can see a lot of them. And so you have an opportunity to learn the ins and outs of them more than some of the other species. And that's critical because it becomes a familiar bird that gives you a frame of reference when another species comes before you, and you can say, oh, I can see that's different because of this, this, and that. So really important. In bird bombs, I brought out some other reference species I recommend in some of the prior episodes with the warblers we have now. The most common one that we need to know well so we can compare yellow-rumped warbler. And you can see some of these other common birds that we use as a frame of reference to help us study the less frequently encountered individuals. So reference species is a really important concept to get. Again, we have our 5 genera represented here in these pictures. Hopefully you can remember the names of each of them: Tyrannus, Maiarchus, Seornis, Cantopus, and Empidonax. All right. So before we go any farther with the identification points and looking in a little more detail, let's take a step back and consider, where's that on a flycatcher? Where's the bird topography here? What are the names of things? So we get our bearings for talking about different flycatcher markings. And the way to start first is just getting back to some of the basics, some of the basic parts that we're all familiar with. And especially like to point out the different flight feather tracks and the things on the wing, because we want to know what we're looking at there. Remember, the wing bars are formed by pale tips on two tracks of secondary coverts. And then we have the flight feathers proper. We have primaries, secondaries, and tertials. And when the bird has its wings closed, and mostly with flycatchers, we're studying closed wings, the outer feathers fold under the inner feathers. So the tertials end up on top, then the secondaries under them, mostly kind of hidden, and the primaries sticking out farther because they're longer. Notice the pale edges on the tertials and even on these secondaries, creating an important feature that I like to call a wing panel. So I'm talking about the wing panel. I'm basically talking about what we see on the closed wing, and particularly the area of the wing bars and the tertials and the secondaries. And sometimes there are contrasting markings there. Notice the pale edges on these tertials and the tips on these covert feathers creating the wing bars. And that can be either more contrasty, like on this upper bird, or can be less contrasty, like on the lower bird. And that can be an important feature to consider. That's what that's about. And then there's a detail, and this is kind of beyond some folks, and you have to train your eyes how to look at it. But with the photos that we can get, you can look at this in your photos. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time tonight talking on this, but I do highlight it in the further slides. And that's primary projection. This is how the long the wings are relative to other parts of the bird's body, especially in this case, the tertials. So the primary projection, I've marked in yellow lines on this left-hand bird. Here's the end of the tertials. Here's the end of the primaries. And so that is our primary projection. It's kind of long on this bird. On the one over here on the right, it's kind of short. And so that plays out partly sometimes in the distance they're migrating. Longer migrating birds have longer wings in general, but it's a feature that we can look at. So that's what primary projection is. It's the difference from the end of the tertials to the end of the primaries. You can also compare where the end of the primaries are falling relative to the tail, and shorter primary projection tends to give an impression of a longer tail, and longer wings tend to give the impression of a shorter tail. All right, so we talk about eye rings, and they come in different shapes and different degrees of completeness. We have rounded eye rings, we have almond-shaped eye rings. In other words, the eye ring is pulled back. And even with species that have complete eye rings, like on this Cordilleran flycatcher, you can see that at the top of it, in this particular view, it doesn't show up as much. So when you get close looks at some of these birds, or you're looking at photos, you'll notice some irregularities. And sometimes it's a characteristic of the eye ring, but the shape is important. Flycatchers, when you look, you will wonder about the shape of their head. Some have characteristically peaked crowns, not really a crest, but we'll call it a peak. Some are flatter or more rounded in the crown. And the underparts tend to have the basic names that we're familiar with. With a couple species, we are interested in whether they have a vest at all. The olive-sided flycatcher here has a very prominent vest, so it looks like it's wearing a vest. I should say the whole thing is like the vest, but it's kind of split down the middle with that vested look. All right, so that's what we're talking about there. And notice the bill on flycatchers. It's very important for identification of some of the smaller species in particular. What is the pattern? First, what's the size and shape of the bill, especially when viewed from underneath, if you have that opportunity. But what is the pattern on it? It's many of these birds have pale-based or pale lower mandibles, but there may be some dark out toward the tip. So on these two species I've highlighted, we see one on the left, which is a gray flycatcher with a pale base, but it's got a distinct dark tip. But the Cordilleran flycatcher on the right has a pale base with no dark tip. And you can kind of see some differences even in the shape of the bills, even in those shots. Lastly, flycatchers have tails. Tail feathers are called rectrices, singular rectrix, but we can just call them tail feathers. And sometimes we're concerned with the outer web of the outer tail feather or outer rectrix. And so that's just referring to the outer portion of that tail feather. It's important for kingbird ID, for example. All right, so we'll start out with our first genus, and that is the kingbirds, Tyrannus, kings of the road. And we have 3 species, and I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on these guys because I did a whole other bird balm last May 24, 2022, Kings of the Road, and you can find that on the DFO page, but we will take a little time to go through, and we'll begin with our distribution. And we can see that one of these species is a much more widespread and than the other 2, the western kingbird, occurring all over the eastern part of the state and commonly in parts of the western portion of the state. And this is a bird of wide open habitat and woodland edges. We don't find them up in the mountains. It's the earliest kingbird to arrive and really the latest to leave on average. Then the Cassin's kingbird is much more locally distributed. You can see the parts of the state here where it is generally concentrated. We can see them in migration elsewhere at times, but these are the areas you need to go if you want to study them, really. And some of these are pretty close to the metro area, particularly out in Elbert County, one of my very favorite Colorado counties. Cassin's kingbird can be quite numerous out there. Cassins are birds of riparian corridors, pinyon juniper, woodland and forest edges, open areas with trees, not so wide open areas as the western kingbird. During September, you can see them commonly during migration away from nesting areas, a little bit in the spring as well, especially if there's a storm situation happening. The eastern kingbird is mostly true to its name, eastern in its distribution, and we can see it's mostly across the northern 2/3 or so of the prairie part of the state, reaching down to that Arkansas corridor, Arkansas River corridor. And these are birds of open areas, but they tend to be associated with the agriculture and wet areas more so than the other species. They have a spotty presence on the western part of the state. All right, so here's our 3 kingbirds. And western kingbird on the left is one of our reference species. And it's the one that we can see all over the place in our area here around the Denver metro area. And things that are important to notice are the paler gray on the head and breast, and the paler tone of yellow. And the whitish throat malar area here blends into the gray of the throat, breast, and of the breast and the side of the face here. So it's kind of a blended look. And notice the white outer edges, white outer webs on the outer rectrices. Okay, so that's a distinctive mark for the western kingbird. Again, pale gray. Notice kingbirds tend to be a little bit greenish and brownish above, brown on the wings, often a green tone on these western kingbirds on the back. It may just look gray depending on lighting and where. Notice the white feather edges. Here's one in flight, those white edges showing up real well. Notice the blended look on the throat here with the breast so that you don't get any strong contrast. Young western kingbirds, we can see a lot of those come late July, mid-July into August, and they are similar to adults, but some things I'll point out is that the young flycatchers in general with kingbirds, certainly they are paler than the adults. So you get a little bit of yellow down here and even a lighter gray, but not as much as we saw on the adult western kingbird. And they often show this kind of masked look or this dark line through the eye. And these pale feather edges on the wing covert here are helping us to confirm that this is indeed a young bird with very fresh feathers. All right, there's an adult. And this one brings to mind a reality that we need to consider lighting when we're evaluating the darkness of gray or the brightness of yellow or the contrast of the malar area. So with these birds and with flycatchers in general, when they're in a somewhat shaded situation or the bird has a sun to its back, the grays are going to look a little darker and the yellows are going to look a little brighter. When it's in the full sun on the part of the body, those areas get washed out and they tend to look paler. So important point to consider in general. All right, so let's look at our Cassin's kingbird here. Look at that contrast on the throat between the malar here and white malar and throat with the rest of the bird's head on down to the breast, a really strong contrast. And it's brighter underneath than the western kingbird, given similar lighting. And notice the tail here on this bird. We'll look at that in another image in just a minute, but it not only has some pale along the sides of the tail, but it has pale at the tips of the tail feathers, lacking in the western kingbird, as you can compare over to the left. So that's an important point for the Cassin's kingbird. There's a nice look here. Notice the pale tips on those tail feathers. Notice the kind of real kind of dusky gray of the head and that nice malar contrast. A little brighter underneath. Good hooked bill showing on that bird. That white contrast really shows up well in a lot of different settings once you learn how to look at it. You can see the pale tips on the tail feathers of this bird in flight. And again, on this one as well. Even though the Cassin's kingbird has pale edges on the outer tail feathers, the pale doesn't go all the way to the base of the tail, all the way to the shaft of the tail feather, as it does on the western kingbird over on the left. See that white going way up there? It's actually going all the way to the shaft of the feather. But on the Cassin's, it's just on the outer part. But you can see those pale tips showing up well on that bird in flight. And look at that contrasting throat. All right, so the eastern kingbird is a little easier to identify than the others generally because it's black/gray and white. No yellow here, and none of that gray on the breast that we see on the other kingbird species. There's a beautiful white tips on the tail feathers that can wear to become less prominent during the summertime, and lots of nice edgings on the various feathers of the wing panel. They have a little bit of a gray at the sides of the breast that can be more or less prominent depending on lighting. So I've skipped over the sounds these birds are making, even though I put some notes in the boxes down below, because I just don't have time to deal with that. But I will just take a step back here and say the sounds of flycatchers are very important and can be critical to ID. So I'm going to turn you to other resources online and with Merlin and even Nathan Pepolo's great books on bird vocalizations to help you with that. And you do want to pay attention to that. In fact, you can probably identify just about any flycatcher if you can see the shape of the bird, how it's behaving, and have a good sense of some of its sounds, even if you can't see any other field marks. So that's a pretty good thing to consider. All right, so our second genus, Myarchus, has the elegant ash-throated flycatcher as our representative here for bird bombs. I really love these guys. They make great sounds and they can be very vocal at times. And this is a bird of kind of open woodland, brushy habitats, pinyon juniper woodland, riparian habitat. And unlike the others, as I mentioned before, these guys nest in cavities, right? But they don't occur too much in the Denver metro area or along the northern Front Range region. They're mostly distributed to the south. A little bit of nesting records from further north, but primarily we're looking at the bird out in the west of the mountains or down in the south central southeast part of Colorado, where they can be very common down in that area in their proper habitats. Great area to study them. But along the metro area, we don't see the ash-throated too much. So you have to kind of go out of your way to get some good experiences for those. But we should watch for other Myarchus species, especially in the late summer and fall. The graph here is just kind of showing us how we have a nice spring peak and it kind of tapers off and doesn't have much of a presence through the summertime. This graph reaching all the way from Pueblo up to Larimer and including the metro area. So Myarchus, these birds, remember, have rust in the flight feathers, especially in the primaries, and they have rust on the tail. Different species to different degrees on the tail, and the exact pattern of that can be important when considering different Myarchus species. But for the ash-throated, we see rust, and that takes us to that group. All right, so they tend to be slim and they have an obvious peak crown, and the breasts tend to be pretty pale gray on ash-throated, and the yellow is pretty pale. In fact, in bright light, it can kind of wash out altogether, like that central bird in this image is not really showing a whole lot. They tend to have a laterally compressed head. When they look at you head on, you see that the head looks kind of flattened from left to right. There's a juvenile on the right there looking nice and fluffy. So one perched in juniper, typical of one of the typical habitats. And there's a nice look at the rusty tail. That is a good giveaway for Myarchus and will help us to take us to to the ash-throated. You can see the dark patterning on these tail feathers on the left-hand bird. That's the kind of some of the details you would want to look at in considering comparison to other Myarchus species, but we're not going to worry about those tonight. Here's the other, just a quick look, great crested flycatcher, the other one that we can regularly see in Colorado if you get out to the far eastern part of the state at the right time of year, or even during migration, not so far out. They're yellower and a little darker in their markings and different vocalizations, different tail pattern too. So Saornis, the phoebes. So as we look at these three species here, we have one that's very widespread and two that are fairly limited in their distribution by comparison. So the Say's phoebe is the widespread one, occurring all over the prairie region in arid, open areas, settings in the mountains, even mountain valleys like South Park and San Luis Valley, and then widespread west of the mountains. And the Say's phoebe is one that likes more arid settings. You tend to see it in open areas, often away from water, but they do nest on bridges and rock faces and under eaves. You may have one nesting in your house under the eave. And it's the earliest one to come in and the last one to leave. And as I said, it's the only flycatcher we have that spends any time here in the winter. So let's look to the eastern phoebe. And notice for the eastern on these maps, for the eastern in the black, it says 2012. This is from the Colorado Breeding Bird Atlas, which collected data through that year. So it's kind of up to date through that for these maps. So you can see the eastern is primarily distributed in the southeast and just a little bit along the Front Range edge. And they like stream corridors or being adjacent to bodies of water. And their population and their range is expanding and their population is growing along the Front Range margin. So here's a more recent image, which is eBird now, showing records from the whole period that eBird has. And you can see there's a lot of presence in, I'm going to flash back here from the Breeding Bird Atlas. They had a few breeding confirmations, but there's a strong presence of eastern phoebe all along the Front Range and so on now that wasn't there before. And the black phoebe on the right is even more limited in its distribution, and it has undergone a very interesting range extension that has brought it to the Front Range area where it did not historically occur. And you can see on this Atlas map through 2012 that there weren't any in the Denver metro area, northern Front Range area at all. But now, indeed, they occur quite a bit. So here's the data up to 2013. Notice there's nothing north of Pueblo on this eBird map. And then boom, here's the data through now. And you have these occurrences, Colorado Springs and in the metro area, Boulder area, and on up into Larimer County. So this is a range extension and it's creating an interesting situation that we'll touch on in a minute. The eastern phoebe and the black phoebe are very similar in their habitat selection. They like to be along streams or near open water. They nest in the same way, and both are increasing. One has colonized the area. So here they are lined up, and two of them are pretty distinctive in their markings, but lighting can play tricks on you. The Say's is the earth tone phoebe, sandy gray upper parts and that distinctive rusty belly. That kind look yellow in certain lights, something to consider. Don't confuse it with a kingbird, remember different shapes. And phoebes, the Say's pumps its tail up and down, especially when it's landing. And that kind of pumping is somewhat vigorous, and then they tend to settle down after several pumps, but they could pump even after they're perched there for a little bit. And the eastern phoebe, I'm going to stick with Say's here for a minute. Let's just look at a few more pictures of our Say's phoebe with that rusty belly and that kind of sandy tan upper parts. Sometimes the head appears the darkest part. Here's an example of a bird in poor lighting, presenting some challenges, but notice the dark tail. So the tail is the darkest part of Say's phoebe, and that's usually pretty evident when you're looking at the bird, even in a distance, or even if it's turned away from you and you can't see the rusty belly, you can see that contrasting dark tail without any adornments. Beautiful shot of a couple in flight there. Here's one nesting under the eaves of a house. They build a cup nest that they put onto some kind of a platform or ledge type setting. Handsome birds. Now the eastern phoebe, I'm going to back up to the featured picture here. These guys are distinctively dark-headed and contrastingly, sometimes a little bit olive brown above, and they're pale below. Notice the smudgy area on the sides of the breast. It's not very distinct, but it's definitely there, and it's just occupying the sides of the breast, coming out towards the middle, but not to the middle. And it's kind of a limited area of not particularly dark coloring. There's no eye rings or conspicuous pale wing bars. And the eastern phoebe is another tail wagger, and it even will kind of move its tail back and forth, up and down, a little bit circular. It's the most expressive tail of all the phoebes, I think. Deliberate, slow movements of the tail. So again, look for that patch on the side of the breast. Look for the dark head as the darkest part of the bird. Notice that contrasting dark head. This one in this lighting is showing a little more yellow on the underparts. They do have a yellowish wash there. It varies a little bit. Some have hardly any, some a little more pronounced. But in a strong light, it kind of washes out. In a more shaded view like this, you can kind of see those yellow tones a little bit better. All right. So the black phoebe is the most dapper looking of all of them and the most distinctive. It's the only black and white flycatcher in the US. And it has this nice white belly and vent with a crisp demarcation from the rest of the black on the underparts there. Oops, I didn't get to my last phase. Last Eastern. Okay, I'm ahead of myself. So just backtrack a bit here. I was making a point of things about the eye ring and no eye ring and inconspicuous wing bars with the eastern phoebe, because it can look similar to a wood-pewee or even an Empidonax flycatcher. Now it's bigger, and those eye ring and wing bar differences are something that you can look at to help you sort those out. All right, so we get to the black phoebe with that nice black and white tuxedo or whatever it is suit that it's wearing, a little paler above on the back, a little bit grayish. Very handsome birds. We don't see a whole lot of these, but they are turning up, and you can go to places in Colorado where you can see them regularly. They're often near water, sometimes often perched down right over the water itself. And the black phoebe flips its tail up and down in kind of a relaxed way. So it's a little more sedate in that, or not quite as deliberate in its movements as the other two phoebes are. Here's a juvenile black phoebe, and what you can tell on juvenile birds, first, they look a little softer in their plumage because the feathers are actually a little softer. Notice this pale gape. That's a giveaway for a fresh juvenile bird, and it will retain that for some period of time. And juvenile flycatchers also have pale, or rather buff, or sometimes even somewhat rusty tips on their wing coverts that create wing bars that are buff or kind of orangey in this case. That'd be lacking on the adult phoebe. You may still see a hint of wing bars on the adult, but not with that color of buff. So buff wing bars indicates a juvenile bird. So here's the fun thing. We have hybrid eastern and black phoebes to deal with here along the Front Range, and this is developing news. So this is just something that's been coming into play really over the last decade. Both these species are expanding along the Front Range, and hybrids and mixed pairs have been detected now for several years, and detections of hybrids between these two species are increasing, at least in some areas. Particularly in the western Denver metro area, the majority of nesting non-says are hybrid phoebes. Okay, so think about that. So let's set aside the says phoebe. Between the eastern and the black, the majority of nesting ones in the western Denver metro area, especially in Jefferson County, apparently are hybrids. And pairs can be found where both adults are hybrids, apparently, or one is clearly a hybrid and the other seems to be a more pure individual of one of the other species. So this is a reality that we need to deal with. And most of the hybrids more closely resemble the eastern phoebe in general color tones and pattern. But there tends to be these features of less contrast between the head and back, no yellow on the belly or very limited, and kind of a smudgy, irregular areas to the dusky breast sides, which are more extensive than on the normal eastern phoebe. Some of them look more like black phoebes, but they're not as clean. And the white doesn't extend so far up the breast. They may sound exactly like the parent species, so sound isn't good enough. Whenever you see now in this area during the nesting season, or really at any time now, an eastern phoebe or a black phoebe, you want to document it as best you can with photos and look critically and carefully for anything that seems intermediate or off for one of the parent species and document that, because we have a lot of hybrids to deal with, and we can deal with this a little seriously by realizing that we need to look carefully. And some of the hybrids look a lot like the normal parent forms or pure forms. So here's our Contopus species. The olive-sided is a montane species. We see it distributed in the mountains. It's rather thinly distributed in its forests. It can be widespread and it can be regularly encountered, but on a given day, you're probably only going to hear or find one or a few or a small number of olive-sided flycatchers. They have large territories and they distribute themselves widely across the landscape. The western wood-pewee is more widely distributed and even nesting out on the prairie and in much lower elevations and out into western Colorado west of the mountains. This is a bird of open woodland, riparian, aspen forest, and along the edges of conifer forest. It is really the most common flycatcher, I think, that you will encounter in general during your birding in Colorado is the western wood-pewee. It's numerous during migration and it's pretty common as a breeder. So a great reference species. These birds winter all the way down in the Andes and come up here to North America, to our Rockies and other mountains in the West to breed. So it's kind of an interesting connection way down there. The olive-sided is larger and it has a big head and a strongly peaked crown, and it has that strong vested look. Notice that the sides are somewhat mottled or even looked a little bit streaked. So it's not kind of evenly washed with gray, but there's that patterning there and a strong contrast with the throat and the middle part of the breast that are white. Bill's big. Here's a bird perching away. And we can't see now a diagnostic feature, but when the wings are relaxed or the wings are open, it shows these cottony patches on the sides of the rump that is diagnostic olive-sided. So you might see that even far away on a bird perched. And these guys like to perch up on the tippy tops of trees. If you see a flycatcher way on the top of the highest tree around, it usually turns out to be an olive-sided flycatcher. And we love their song, "Quick, 3 beers." Or their loud call, pip, pip, pip. So their calls carry a long distance. You can hear them far away with their songs and their calls. There's those white patches. A white patch on one side, the bird has drooped its wing, revealing them. He's maybe preening or relaxed, but when they're in a active position, we don't see those. Bill is broad and big. Tippy top, king of the world. So the western wood-pewee is smaller, and yet it's bigger than the Empidonax and has longer wings. It's kind of sooty gray-brown. And notice the undersides have a little vested look, but it's not as clean as the olive-sided. And the sides of the breast don't have any mottling or streaking. It's kind of an even wash. And generally, they don't show any yellow or anything like that underneath, and no green tones. It's mostly just grays, dusky tones, and whitish. The lower mandible on the western wood-pewee is mostly dark. And unlike some other flycatchers, they don't flick their wings and tail, so that can be an important clue. They tend to perch out on the sides of trees or not up on the tippy top of the highest tree at least, which the olive-sided does characteristically. I've got a couple non-Contopus species there that are pretty similar in general to pewees, eastern phoebe and several of the flycatcher species for comparison. Note the eye rings and wing bars on the flycatcher, the different shape of the pewee. He's got his wings open, showing that there's no white patches on my rump. This guy's showing pretty prominent wing bars, relatively speaking, but no real good pale edges on the tertials and not much of an eye ring at all. And the underparts have that little bit of vest down the middle and that nice even wash of gray on the sides. Here's a couple babies. Remember, babies are given away when they're real fresh by their kind of soft appearance, but also that pale gape. And notice the buffy tone on the wing bars and tertial edges of these birds, a giveaway for a juvenile. You can see the characteristic shape of the birds in general, kind of sooty coloration. Even the bird in the shadow is showing that nice peaked head, not as big of a peak on the more large-headed olive-sided, but good shape. All right, so we get to our last genus, and this is the Empidonax. And these guys are some of the most difficult to identify of Colorado's birds. So even expert birders are continually challenged, if they're honest, by identification of the Empidonax flycatchers. The thing is that they all kind of look the same. They're all small. They lack obvious differences in size, structure, and plumage patterns. There are differences, but not obvious strong ones. They have a very active feeding style, hard to keep up with, get good looks at, and they tend to disappear before you can study them well. And more than some of the others, they tend to be hidden among foliage or places where they're hard to view well. And there can even be more variation at times within a species, individual to individual, than between any two species. It's crazy. And photos of the same bird can show in different lightings and angles birds that appear different. So it seems like throw up your hands. What are we going to do? Well, you know, back in the day, here's Roger Torrey Peterson from 1941 saying, collecting has proven it's nearly impossible to name many individuals in the field. So the wise field man, quoting Peterson here, usually lets most of them go as just Empidonaxes. So we've come a long way from then in our knowledge of ID of these birds. But even Ken Kaufman, a modern bird expert, said in his Advanced Birding, if you reach the stage at which you feel you can name every impid you see in the field, you are probably deluding yourself. Okay, so let's take that seriously. Field recognition of these impids must develop through birds of known identity. All right, so if you really don't know what you're looking at, then it's hard to know for sure that you're making the correct decisions about what you're seeing. So the very best thing you can do is to study birds that are singing in breeding habitat when you have the opportunity. So they're just going to be arriving in the state now. Some of them are going to be passing through, and migrants are going to occur in a variety of habitats. But before long, they're only going to be in their breeding areas. Pretty much by the end of May, when migration's done for the most part, and we see them in the habitats where they nest. So that's a great way to learn them, is to go to those places where you can help to know what you're looking at using habitat and singing birds. And consider everything you can see on the bird. And a brief view of an Empidonax flycatcher can be a deadly view to try to make a conclusion as to what it is. And there's always going to be individuals that, if you're honest, simply defy certain identification, and some really are not identifiable. All right. Hoffman says the very worst approach to learning them is to identify non-singing birds on migration. So that may be when we get to see some of these, but get yourself up to where they're breeding. And even if you convince yourself of the identity, you never know for sure, and all of your impressions may turn out to be false. So that should be some pretty sobering wisdom for us. And the pro tip here is don't be afraid of Empidonax spa. It should always be, if you go through spring and into summer and you're not reporting any unidentified Empidonax, then you're not as good as you really think you are. Make sure first that you're not looking at something else. Okay, so the wood-pewees and Empidonax are generally similar, but the Empidonax are smaller, very active in their feeding style, noticeable eye ring and wing bars, different shaped head, shorter wings, and they change perches a lot rather than coming back to the same perch that we see in the pewees and olive-sided flycatcher. Consider these things as you're looking at Empidonax, and we won't worry too much about some of these details, but these are important things to consider. How's the bird worn? What is its molt timing? What is the age of the bird you're looking at? What are the lighting conditions? Very important. Kind of a bright shade is the very best situation to be evaluating color and shading details on Empidonax flycatchers. Also factor in how much you really need to see this species. If you really need that one, you're more prone to turn it into that one. And how many beers have you had? Because that's going to influence your identification of the birds. So real quick through our gnat king distributions, we can look at these graphs and see that basically none of them are nesting in the prairie area. They're all nesting in the mountains or west or right up along the edge of the Front Range, a little bit out into the flats in the metro area, but not really out in the prairie proper or what we have left of prairie. And they can move into some of those low areas because of urban forests that have been planted. The willow flycatcher, true to its name, is a breeder in willow riparian, and the dusky flycatcher is one of shrub and oak habitats, open conifer forest edges. The least flycatcher has a very limited distribution in Colorado, but there's certain areas where they can be fairly numerous, particularly here in the parts of the metro areas, most especially at Chatfield State Park, upstream of Kingfisher Bridge. If you want to see least flycatchers, go there. You can find a lot of them when they're fully arrived. And the Hammonds is a montane species. It's a higher elevation than most of these others in terms of where you first start to encounter them. And they like mature closed forests and mixed conifer forests with aspens and such. The Cordilleran flycatcher is another bird that's associated with shaded settings. They're very common in the Front Range area. And so it's one that we can study really well. But I chose dusky flycatcher as the reference species because it is the one that looks more similar to some of the other species, and it is really the one of the migrants that you can encounter most frequently, and sometimes it's the most numerous impid that you'll see over the course of the season if you disregard the Cordilleran flycatcher. And then lastly, the gray flycatcher is essentially a western bird of dry habitats, PJ woodland, open scrubby habitats and things. The gray flycatcher rather is what I meant. I'm not sure what I said. All right, so a quick look at our notorious gnat kings, and I've kind of grouped them in two sets of three. Two of these are somewhat distinctive as far as they go. The least is more similar to some of the other ones, but the willow is bigger, browner, and it looks the most like a pewee out of the group, partly because of its coloration, and its eye ring is often least pronounced. The least flycatcher is a small, active flycatcher. It's got relatively large head and a little bill, and it's kind of contrasty, good wing panel contrast, and often has a conspicuous eye ring that's drawn back a little bit behind the eye into an almond shape. And they're pretty active with wing flicks and tail flicks, even flicking wings and tail at the same instant. So really active that way. The Cordilleran flycatcher, not Cordilleran, some people just say Cordy, but it's Cordilleran flycatcher is referring to mountain range, right? Is small, and it's got a big head, and it's the only one out of our Empidonax that are the ones we're looking at here that is really green and yellowish, olive and yellowish, olive above and yellowish toned underneath, very much so. And it has a very pronounced almond-shaped eye ring, and often is not white, but is kind of an off-white or even yellowish. And the lower mandible is entirely pale. Cordilleran flycatcher. So we'll take some closer look at some of these. There's our willow with its brown tones, inconspicuous eye ring, looking kind of like a pewee, but it does have an eye ring, and it's differently patterned underneath, not as extensively gray, and it often actually has a little bit of yellow tones down there that the pewee lacks. There's some notes for differentiating. Least flycatcher, very nice, bold eye ring, contrasty wing panel, small bill. A lot of dark on the underside of the bill of that individual. A little bit of head contrast there with the browner back. And our Cordilleran with his characteristic yellowish underneath and that wide bill with unmarked lower mandible. You can see that eye ring. Gives it a very distinctive look with the big head and the almond-shaped eye ring and the coloration, often in the shade. Here's our other three, Hammonds, dusky and gray. Now, these guys all kind of look similar. The gray is actually a little distinctive in its behavior and in its shape. Hammonds and dusky can appear quite similar, and we want to throw the least in here when we're considering birds in migration out of breeding habitat as one to consider along with these. The Hammonds is small, it's got a big head, a short little bill, and it's very active. There's often a contrast with the crown and the back. And here's a really important point. Out of all of these Empidonax we're looking at, this is the only one that molts on its summer grounds. So when we see them in later August and into September, you see a nice contrasty looking clean bird of this sort. It's going to be the Hammond's flycatcher. The others are worn and drabber. The dusky flycatcher is drab at that time. It doesn't molt until it gets to its wintering grounds. So a freshly plumaged bird, say in September, early September, is going to be a Hammond's most likely, just by that clue. Conspicuous eye ring, the little tiny bill, and they have a distinctive call note. It's kind of like a pygmy nuthatch, different from the others. Little bill, conspicuous eye ring, little head contrast, bill with a little dusky toward the tip. There's a real characteristic look of what a Hammond's looks like. Okay, so the dusky flycatcher has, I think one of the ways I can pick them out is by looking at the eye ring. The way it's kind of disappears over the top of the eye and gets real thin under the eye. The bird has a long shape to it. The tail looks relatively long, and overall the plumage is kind of drab compared to other species. You put those things together, and it often pops up to me as a dusky flycatcher. Not so much contrast on the wing panel as on a least flycatcher. You're looking at the underside of the bill. It's pale based, but becomes dusky toward the tip. Kind of gradually. Look at that wing eye ring shape. And there it is again, kind of disappearing over the eye and getting real thin under the eye. The gray flycatcher is indeed, as the name says, it's largely gray. It's the grayest out of the group. And in certain lightings, and as the bird is worn, there may be no yellow evident on the underparts. It's got a nice slim body. It's kind of large, has a relatively long tail, long billed look. It's a little less active than the others, but it has a distinctive behavior of wagging its tail, or dipping its tail rather, deliberately downward, kind of in a phoebe-like fashion. So the other flycatchers are flicking their tail up, but the gray flycatcher a little bit slowly dips its tail down. It's a subtle difference between what a downward dip is versus an upward flick, but they are different. Let's look at a few more pictures here. Notice the bill here with the distinct dusky tip. You can see the gray coloration. The eye ring is complete, and but it's not that conspicuous because it's kind of set against a pale gray. This bird with the head in the shade, the eye ring shows a little more. Notice the bill coloration. So now that we know everything, it's time for us to consider some quizzes. So here we have some old family friends. And that's my very first question is name the bird family that these species belong to. Okay, so we need to learn not only how to identify things and what their common names are, but we need to know how they fit together in the systematics and taxonomy. And so here is, the name is Tyrannidae. All right. Remember, families end with that I-D-A-E ending. Okay, so now which genus do these species belong to? Can you remember the names? And don't just say phoebes and kingbirds. I want the actual genus name. We'll look at them. We got number 1 with the rusty tail, number 2 with the darker head, number 3 looking a little peaked head there, number 4 a little bit yellowish underneath, white edges on the tail sides, number 5 eye ring, wing bars, small greenish yellowish under. Anyway, so here's our genera, the Myarchus, number 1, Seornis, Contopus, Tyrannus, and Empidonax. So if you don't know those already, learn them. And then which species are these? Can you tell? Well, I'm not going to throw any hard curveballs at you with the number one there. You can see the rusty tail, and that's telling us it's one of the Myarchus. And on number two, we can see that it's kind of round-headed, not crested, and the head's a little darker, and just the shape of the bird is giving us some clues there as to what sort of a thing it is. And number three, we see that it's kind of small, and it doesn't have a very big bill. Number four, we see kind of a prominent eye line area here, which is kind of suggesting a young bird, as are the pale edges on those wing coverts. You can see the white edges on the tail going all the way up to the base of the tail. And number five, big wide orange bill, conspicuous eye ring. It looks like it's drawn back. I can even see a little yellowish tone below. So indeed, ash-throated eastern phoebe, western wood-pewee, western kingbird, and Cordilleran flycatcher. So here we have our short-footed friends, and what do we got? There's only two species here. I'll let you look at them for a minute. Look at the underpart patterns, look at any distinctive features, look at the relative size of the head and the crest. Those are the clues, the bill size. First question, which genus do these belong to? We just went over that. Cantopus. And then which species are these? So the ones that have mottled on the sides and have a bigger head and has white patches on the rump, olive-sided, and the ones that are not are the western wood-pewee. Hopefully, just in kind of looking at the shape and getting a sense of those, you might have a little bit to go on. Here's some reminders about the particular field marks. Let's move on here. All right, so here's the hint is in the title of this slide as to what these might be if you've been paying attention. And let's consider which species are these. Well, one of them is disappearing into a hole, which should tell us something right away. And then we see another, let's see, so number one, disappearing in a hole. Number two, out on a fence line, and I see yellow underneath, and I see that little bit of an eye line. We're just looking at a bit of that. Number three has a nest out on a limb inside the canopy of a tree. It's up fairly high, we can tell. And it's kind of all just a dusky underneath and maybe a little bit paler down the center. Number four, we see a contrasting black tail and a little bit of rusty underneath, generally sandy color, tan sand above. And number five over there has got an eye ring and wing bars, and we can tell it's little, and it's kind of got a grayish green tone above. All right, so ash-throated, number one, western kingbird on the fence line, western wood-pewee out of nest. Very characteristic placement of a pewee nest out on a limb like that, usually up in the middle to upper portion of the canopy. And Say's phoebe, number four, in flight, and dusky flycatcher looking over its shoulder. These are all of our reference species. What genus? Remember, so I'm gonna make you learn these. There you go, Myarchus, Tyrannus, Cantopus, Saornis, and Empidonax. Say it 3 times fast. All right, a parting shot. What do you think about this bird? Looks familiar, but less familiar. Here's another view. We notice the little streaking on the sides of the breast, a little bit of coloration on the vent area, the undertail coverts, and the lower part of the belly, or the flanks rather. That's right, I'm playing a trick on you, but if you had the other part of this species, it would be no doubt what it is. This is the vermilion flycatcher, of course, the ruby firehead. And they look a little bit more, if you look at the female here, the left and center pictures, she looks sort of like a phoebe, but some obvious differences in their plumage, and those streaks and the ventral coloration is distinctive. So I had to throw one curveball at you here. And so now I'd like to say, thank you to all of my photo contributors. There are over 24 photographers contributed or provided images that I use for this bird bombs, and I hopefully credited the images on each of the slides. So thank you to all of you who make bird bombs possible through sharing your images. And if you'd like to be a bird bombs photo contributor, I can take your images direct. If you have them on eBird, I can take them directly from there. I'd like to have your permission. you can email me and let me know. We now have a nice archive of past bird bombs on the DFO page. I go to the programs and events page, and you'll find a button below the current programs that says bird bombs. And here's the URL, and that will take you to all 15 prior episodes, and soon this one as well. And I do encourage you to go back and look at this. So I've had to race through some of this, but the idea is you got a lot of information. Go back and look at the video, take your time with it, look at just parts of it, whatever you want, but you can learn that way and soak in a whole lot more. So the next Bird Bombs is coming up on June 22nd. It's going to be about prairie sparrows. So we're going to leave the forest and woodland behind and get out into the grasslands and see some of the prairie sparrows that are a big part of what we can enjoy during the summer and into the beginning of fall migration even. So look forward to seeing you there. I'm going to stop screen sharing and we'll go to our Q&A with Nate.
Awesome. That was very informative. I definitely have to say that I'm going to take you up on going back and looking through it as my brain's a little bit overwhelmed. We had a couple great, I think, quick questions. And one that I want to start with because it's about one of my favorite birds, which is the black phoebe. And somebody was just wondering if dapper is a technical term that they should be using out in the field, or if that's sort of just your own personal opinion there.
Yeah, no, you definitely want to get expressive with the term. So let's get creative and don't feel like you have to be an ornithologist and hold back and just use technical terms, but you can use whatever is going to best describe what you're looking at. All right, so we hear about birds in tuxedos even and things like that. It's a little bit anthropomorphic, but dappers, that's how they look. Aren't they handsome?
I like I said, one of my favorite birds, so I definitely agree with you there. Yeah, and then we had kind of a specific question about the olive-sided flycatcher, and someone looks like was doing double duty here with their Sibley's Field Guide out as well, trying to look at some more pictures. And they were wondering about the white tufts that you talked about. Is that something that's only seen on juvenile birds, or is that seen on all of them?
I believe it's on all of them, certainly on adults. The thing is, it's often hidden. When the bird is in an alert posture and has its wings in a normal closed position, those tufts are generally out of view underneath the wings. When the bird relaxes its wings or is preening, or maybe it flaps its wings a little bit or something, then you can see those. Sometimes you can look at an olive-sided perched on, well, it may be perched on the tippy top of a tree, which would tell you something, but you're even far away and it's got its back to you and it's relaxed its wings and you can see those two white tufts on the side. It's a diagnostic mark, but you can't always see it.
Yeah, and then I guess this question is kind of my own personal question going off of what you were just talking about with the olive-sided, and thinking about some of the challenges of the differences in the field marks being pretty tricky to see, especially with the Empids. Is there sort of like a cutoff where, migration is wound down that you would recommend that people could maybe start to lean a little bit more towards using habitat to support them in an ID?
Well, first you want to consider where is the bird. If it's out in the prairie, or mostly for most of the species, like here in the metro area around town or whatever, out at the arsenal, out at Lagerman Reservoir, whatever, there's no Empidonax nesting out there. So it's definitely, you're looking at migrants and habitat. Sort of means nothing. They still have little preferences in how they sort themselves out according to how what they're in is structured, but a forest bird can show up in an open setting and so on. So generally, the spring migration is going to trail off as we get toward the end of May. And at the same time, these birds are going to where they want to nest. So dusky flycatchers starting like this week, next week, are returning to where they're nesting in our foothills and montane areas. So if I go up Deer Creek Canyon now, I can find dusky flycatchers in their appropriate scrubby oak habitat, and I'm not going to find some of the others there probably. The migrants are a little harder to encounter in the mountains than they are out in the prairie or along the Front Range edge, has been my experience. But once we get past this month, it's pretty good timing. And then when we get into August, things are moving around again, and some bets are off.
Awesome. And someone also just, along with lots of people, just really appreciating the work that you put into this. Wanted to shout out that there is a new field guide out there for flycatchers, but If people are looking for more than just books, do you have any sort of recommendations and opportunities that DFO might have coming up for folks to get out there and look at some of these birds?
Yeah, definitely study the books and especially to learn like what you're supposed to be looking at. But you can find it very confusing when you start to look at the images and photos in the various guides, and then you see the bird in the field because you learn some background, but the two don't always really connect that well. It's just the way it goes because they are very variable, and lighting and so on can affect things quite a bit. The best way, as Kaufman was saying, is to work with known identity birds. Well, if you're a newer birder or maybe haven't had as much experience with some of these, it's great to hook up with somebody else that knows what they're looking at through experience. And a great way to do that is on a DFO field trip. We're going to be seeing a lot of flycatchers on our field trips in the rest of this month and on into the summer. And many of our leaders are pretty skilled at sorting through things and will really help you kind of work through it. So it's a good way to know what you're looking at. And I just want to add too, we can take pictures of these birds and we can take the photo later and look at it, or even in the field, but we can look at the photo, but that's not quite the same thing as looking at the bird in life and understanding how it looks through your eyeballs, not through an image that you're looking at later on. So don't waste your opportunity by just taking picture, and not looking at the bird with your own eyes, watching how it's moving, pay attention to what sounds it's making. Very important that you don't get just hung up in just taking a bunch of pictures and looking at them at home later and then trying to sort out what it is. It's going to be a deadly exercise. You don't want to do that. So definitely go check out DFO field trips. We have a lot of field trips coming up. There are openings on many trips right now. And some of them have no limits of people, and you can get out with people that know what they're looking at, and they'll help you out a lot.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I think that takes care of all the questions. We have one last question for a young birder out there that I want to make sure we hit that I didn't see until now, but wondering if ash-throated flycatcher, can that be found at Pueblo Reservoir?
Yes. So, well, they breed in pinyon juniper woodland, which occurs down there. It's mostly just juniper at that location, but they do breed in that region of the state. So when you get in and also get into riparian areas, sometimes you might encounter them. I don't know about Pueblo Reservoir riparian areas, but generally speaking, they are down there. And if you get that far south, you're in the area where they are.